The COVID-19 pandemic has not only altered the physical health of much of the world, but also its economic health. We're joined today by Professor Leo Lederman, Chief Economic Advisor of Bank Hapoalim, who will talk about Israel's economy in the shadow of the novel coronavirus.
Mr. Reuven Rivlin, President of the State of Israel, Mr. Tony Blair, former UK Prime Minister, Mr. Ronald Lauder, President of the World Jewish Congress, Mr. David Friedman, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mr. Sylvan Adams, ministers in Israel's government, members of the Knesset, distinguished speakers, and guests. We are honored at Bank Hapoalim, the largest commercial bank in Israel, to be a sponsor of this very important event. Thanks very much to the Jerusalem Post for organizing this conference. No doubt, this is one of the most important political and diplomatic meetings for the Jewish world. The conference this year is held at a time of stress and crisis in the whole world in view of the COVID-19 pandemic. People around the globe are currently in a mode of back to basics, that is, attempting to ensure that they remain healthy with a stable job and income and taking all precautions for having as little damage as possible during this difficult episode. Of all pandemics in history, this is the one that meets the world, for good or bad, with a relatively high degree of globalization. As Bill Gates put it, the worst pandemic in modern history was the Spanish flu of 1918, which killed tens of millions of people. Today, with how interconnected the world is, it would spread even faster. On the economic front, Israel entered the crisis with favorable economic conditions: robust growth, full employment, a low ratio of public sector debt to GDP, and a high private savings rate. We were one of the first countries to close its borders and adopt a strict lockdown, which gave positive results for dealing with the initial stage of the crisis. By mid-May, policymakers lifted many of the restrictions imposed at the onset of the pandemic. Yet, as you know, the second wave of contagion did not wait until the coming winter, not only in Israel, but all over the world, and consequently, we have entered recently a second episode of partial lockdown. Pandemics and lockdowns are not good for any economy. The whole world is experiencing the worst recession since the Great Depression of 1929. Obviously, any forecasts about this and the next year are accompanied by a great degree of uncertainty, especially about the future evolution of COVID-19. The latest forecast of world GDP growth by the OECD points to a decline of 4.5% this year and a recovery at a rate of 5% next year. Obviously, should wide quarantines return, the output fall this year will increase and the recovery next year will weaken. Based on the foregoing estimates, our latest forecasts for Israel's GDP are a fall of about 5% this year, maybe even a bit more, to be followed by positive growth of 4% next year. These and the global forecasts could be subject to updates depending on the evolution of the coronavirus. Israel's economic performance is a reflection of global conditions, and it is not markedly different from those of the US, Germany, and the Netherlands. Our growth performance is much better than that of France, Spain, and Italy. Yet, economies in Asia, such as China and Korea, are showing a more moderate decline in their growth this year. In all cases, COVID-19 has differential effects across sectors. Clearly, tourism, air travel, cultural events, restaurants, and personal services are suffering the most in this crisis. Fortunately, in Israel and the rest of the world, policymakers have moved quickly since the start of the crisis in order to avoid a major economic and social catastrophe. Central banks, including the Bank of Israel, managed to strongly increase liquidity and reduce interest rates. Governments increased spending in order to support the health system infrastructures, as well as to provide support to the unemployed and to the various segments of the economy under high risks of collapse. Let me stress this again. Without the rapid policy response by policymakers, we would be experiencing now a much deeper recession and a much higher unemployment figures than those seen these days. Having said this, and looking forward, we believe that Israel's economy needs political stability. Without a government budget for 2021 and a multi-year economic policy plan, we will not be able to reach the full potential of our economy and to ensure that the engines of growth, reforms, and investment will operate in full power when the time for recovery arrives. There is already plenty of uncertainty all around, but political stability is a necessary condition for continuing to have a vibrant, dynamic ecosystem in Israel. Without it, we will be in disadvantage when competing with other economies. Bank Hapoalim came into the crisis from a position of absolute and relative strength. Specifically, our initial conditions featured a resilient capital position, strong liquidity, a diversified low-risk loan book, and a disciplined cost base. Furthermore, our digital preparedness allowed us the ability to provide the majority of our frontline services digitally and in high capacity. As Israel's biggest lender, we continued to support our customers and community during the crisis. Our main goal has been to continue to provide safe and sensitive banking. We continued our tradition of supporting the community. Since the onset of the pandemic, we donated significant funds to different health and social causes and helped raise resources in national campaigns to support those financially affected by the crisis. Looking ahead, it is well to emphasize the wise words of William James, one of the most influential American philosophers, who said, "Pessimism is a source of weakness. Optimism is a source of power." We remain optimists that the forces of science and technology will overcome COVID-19 as soon as this is possible. For Israel and the Jewish world, the signature of historic peace and normalization accords with the UAE and Bahrain are also a source of positive thinking about further breakthroughs with other nations in the region. Bank Hapoalim is honored to be the first banking institution in Israel to sign a Memorandum of Agreement, MOU, with Emirates NBD, the largest lender in the UAE. This is only the first of a series of business cooperation agreements we expect to reach in a gradual way in the future. One of our key goals is to enable Israeli clients to transact directly in the UAE and subsequently in other countries. Finally, to conclude, we spoke about pandemics, economics, banking, yet thinking fast forward, it is well to end with the wise words of David Ben-Gurion, who said, "The state of Israel will prove itself not by material wealth, not by military might or technical achievements, but by its moral character and human values." Thank you very much.